Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the batch video for the web novel Thieves Dungeon from the website Royal Road. This video will contain chapters 1.29 to 1.32, and as always, I hope that you enjoy. Chapter 1.29 Fortune Favors the Bold. There was a carnival atmosphere in Colton today. A great stage was being raised in the city square. The glory bell ringing out was a warm golden note. Swarms of the would-be adventurers massed around the stage, waiting to prove their mettle. The common folk would be amongst them, eating roasted hazelnuts from cups made of broad leaves, rolled into cones, drinking, waiting to see the show. Sweat and cheap sour beer filled the air. At the end of it all, the nobility sat under canopies, leaning into the gossip, making their bets. Afrey sat in a wooden throne above the stage. To her left, Sufi perched on a seat, feet not touching the ground, chin propped up on her two-fingered hand. The seat to her right was empty, the merfolk not even sending a representative, which suited Avery fine. Their arrogance was less threatening to the guild leader's plans than Sufi's half hand and her patient eyes. Cathara lurked in the background, leaning in to whisper into her daughter's ear. With Mogul gone, the clever old witch had outlived all of her rivals. Now she stood behind the throne, clearing the way for all of her heir ascent. Avery had her own shadow. Malvet fidgeted and picked at his face nervously in the light of day, far more of a night creature. The golden chain and seal of the High Mage looking out of place around his scrawny neck. Still, he had done well, sitting before her with 10 vials of dark blue liquid, bottled in round-bellied vials topped with glass stoppers bearing the Institute's 7-pointed star. Life-saving potions all, just one with a special ingredient. On stage, Earth Mages worked to lift 10 pillars of stone, each one as thick and as round as a barrel and as tall as a man. These would be the first test. Avery was dressed to kill today. She wore a hat of crushed red velvet and a long jacket that hung over her shoulders, the ruffled and slashed sleeves hanging empty. A dark burgundy blouse and a black riding pants with the tall boots completed the ensemble. As she rose, the muttering and cheering of the crowd did too. A crescendo of excitement accompanied her words. Adventurers, soldiers of fortune, treasure seekers. Today we determine who shall have the honor of braving the dungeon first, who will be the first in line to fate to deal with the death or glory as she sees fit. If you are faithful, better that you stay at home. If you are weak, there is no place for you in this world of adventurers. In her hand she clutched a spell token, amplifying her voice to boom over the bustling, buzzing sounds of the crowds. Only those who step onto the stage with the strength to break stone pillars will be considered. Only they will move on to the next round, competing to be the first to delve into the dungeon. Now, step forward. First onto the stage, moving even before she had finished speaking, was a wild-looking dwarf with a braided head of fiery red hairs. He carried a cudgel of black wood in a hand, tapping it against his palm, as he stepped forward with a cocky grin, sweeping a bow her way. One swing, and the first pillar shattered like glass. Shards of stone rained back down to the attendant mages, forcing them to lift their hands in a simple warding spell. Dust curled from the broken pillar stub like the smoke of a snuffed cigar. This club, he roared to the crowd, lifting it overhead. 3 golden bands gleamed around the wooden cudgel. This club was made by my forefathers. Each band weighs 10 stone. If ye can't lift it, don't bother getting on stage. What are yours? Avery inquired, leaning over towards Sufi. No, mine have the sense to get drunk after the contest. The young dwarf was frowning intensely. She was pretty in a broad, hearty way, a farm girl kind of charm that likely wouldn't last long as she stared to age. Golden hair was braided with a circuit around her brow, but he might be worth watching. Already, the new contender was stepping onto the stage, a man with a golem arm made out of gleaming bronze. There was not a word exchanged, only a deathly glare, as he pushed past the departing dwarf and swung his metal fist towards the second pillar. Cracks spread out throughout the stone, and after an unsteady moment it collapsed. The man stretched, swinging his mechanical arm through the air as a faint smoke billowed from the joints. Holding back was Avery's judgment. Sufi nodded. By now the crowd was roaring, stomping their feet and hitting a fever pitch. The mages were working to repair the first pillar still, slowly reassembling the pieces. The next unlucky bastard had overestimated himself. He was a tall, muscled brute with a gleaming bald head, and his warhammer failed to make more than a dent in the stone. He had to slink back, the whole of the mob jeering at him. Avery settled back in her chair, calling for wine. It would be a long and busy day. The weight of the crowd's eyes was heavy, their expectations putting on her to play her part and be torn to shreds. Balder Claith was in a terrible state. His clothes were ripped, hands shaking, his face muddy, except for 2 long tracks spilling from his eyes, where he cried himself clean again. After the whole affair of signing a contract that was closer to extortion, he'd simply been ignored. In the end, he crawled back up the tunnel that he'd been dragged down, emerging into his shop. The trapdoor slipping shut behind him and becoming invisible. Everything was as he left it. It was as if he'd never been gone. In a way, it was the last straw. It was maddening to think that nobody knew, that he could tell nobody of what happened, that it hadn't disturbed the world in any way for him to disappear into the hellish dark pit, and that when he returned, his life would simply return to normal. Except, always, in the back of his mind, he'd know that there was a secret door hidden in the back room, and that any day there might be a knock, 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 as a spire came calling to take him down to the subterranean realm. He shivered in a cold that only he could feel. Outside, a crowd was cheering for some damn reason, and Valda suddenly knew that he needed to join them, needed to let the noise and stink of other people rattle his own thoughts out of his head, needed to be immersed in the sound of other people's lives instead of stewing away in his own fears. The crowd outside welcomed him, promised to sweep his troubled thoughts away. Strix could see how it would happen now. The air was full of desperate prayer, not prayer to any one god, no, nothing so focused or controlled, but a seething mass of hopes and dreams finding its outlet in the screams and the stomp of the crowd, putting them into a rhythm. The city of Bells had long been bruised and humiliated by the faded glory. The hope of revival excited the pride of most had forgotten. She stood at the edge of the crowd, the tall crested owl perched on her shoulder. Only the youngest children were left out, too busy begging their parents for pies or weaving between the mob's feet to chase each other in blissfully pointless games. And here she was, silent still, hanging onto the fence waiting to see who she should give her prophecy to. Morgul's killer, or the ones who would undo everything that he'd worked for in their own pursuit of glory. One had no conception of humanity, the other had willingly abandoned it. She hung back, thinking feelings of raw energy, of what the crowd might produce in the gossip and the cheers. A child running through the streets paused in front of her, swaying on its feet like she had something to say, biting his lip. Strix blinked her blind eyes and then smiled. "Yes, you may pet my owl." The sun's light was streaming down, bringing out brightness out of the market stalls, the glitter of coins changing hands. It grew brighter, the colors of the world seemed to sizzle. The coins had a glow of treasure. People seemed more beautiful and less flawed. The light condensed into a river of sunfire that fell from the skies onto the center stage, and people still stood it, silent and simply awestruck by the entry of the divine into their life. A messenger, stepped on the blazing pillar of light. He was a clown in a golden mask, his outfit pure white, his 3-pointed cap tipped with bells of gold. Above him was a golden wheel, bright as a miniature sun. "Lords and ladies, for you are all lords and ladies today. You have all called for the sun and your fervent hopes, and the sun, in his wisdom, the great soul, has sent me an answer. Today Colton shall receive a blessing, and only the wheel knows what it shall be." The wheel had all eyes captivated on it, began to spin, fires blazing at its edges. "And this too I promise. On the day the brave hero conquers the dungeon, a second blessing shall be won. No city since our old Aether, which lies now in ruins, has received such a bounty. The crowd had no response for once. They were spellbound, stricken silent. The only sound that they made was their breathing as the wheel carried all of their hopes, all of their dreams, and began to slow. One segment after the next ticking by, statues of demons and saints holding up their prizes for the audience to see. Each eye begging for some result that would lift up their lives. The wheel spun, slower and slower, winding down towards a miracle. Drivelin pressed his face against the bars of his lone window. Well, not his face. He was practicing, shifting himself every time the guards looked away, waiting for his chance. He could be old or young, a man or a woman, could wear any face he'd ever seen. It was a damn neat trick. It just wasn't the one that let him tear the bars open and beat the guards with their own limbs, like some adventurers were known to do. He sighed. Oh, he was missing out on something, he just knew it. There was a smell of gambling, a pungent mixture of hope and dread in the air today. End of chapter 1.30. Fresh Canvas. You have reached the next stage. As a dungeon core, you have prevailed in the first milestone and unlocked new capacities. From now on, with each new floor you descend, you may declare a new dungeon law. What you speak shall be. No law may be an absolute bar on continuing. You must always leave a way through you to your core. More limited the law, the more powerful will enforce it. In addition, you may create up to 2 vaults per floor. Vaults are special rooms containing unique conditions to enter or exit, enforced by the power of law. You have matured to the Gem Heart Dungeon Tier 2. Your shards shall reach a new level of power, and you may now create a new blessing by devouring the spell work within enchanted objects. I was excited. My descent had left us in a small, hollowed-out cell within the earth, 10 by 10 coffin. To the core, nothing could have felt more like home. The laws, the blessings, all of them could wait. What I needed now was time to think and grow. My tendrils of ethereal mana began to eat through the walls, expanding my reach outwards. Trace deposits of metals and minerals caused some formations to last moments longer than the rest, making molten and unpredictable shapes briefly appear and the stone around them as they melted away. I stopped, suddenly, struck by what I saw in the churn of random forms. By some miracle chance, an iron vein had formed a perfect image of a tree, made red by rust. It struck the chord with me, and I began to repeat the shape, carving trees out of stone as I expanded and expanded. In no time a forest was born, a grey and red, lifeless. It had a grim and austere beauty to it. I could do better. I used salt, huge dull slabs of crystalline salt, to cover the trees, giving them a pure white aesthetic. The edges were rough, the crystal flaking off and cracking and leaving each tree ruggedly shaped at best. Then I coated the floors with small, colorless grey flowers, a carpet of them stretching throughout the entire lightless cave. It was as if all the color had gone from the world, leaving behind a land of stark white trees and ashen lilies. It was beautiful in the most horrifying way. Now, what could I do with this? Weaving together the roots of the flowers, I found that I could make them interconnected enough that they didn't need solid earth beneath them. Then this way that I could create pitfall traps that were completely disguised under the endless field of grey flowers. The ground was simply not there, the lilies held up by roots of their neighbors. So I went all out. As I expanded, I cut huge chasms that divided the floors into 7 plateaus. Each island was connected to the next by a single bridge, rising up out of the sea of grey lilies and a beautiful, ornate arch made of glass. Anyone descending from the higher floor would be stunned by the monochrome world that I created. The white trees stalk against the cavernous darkness, their limbs melding into the lifting and up of the cavern ceiling. They first see the straightforward field of flowers, albeit a ghostly ethereal one. It was only with deadly trial and error that they discovered the chasms, and their only points of crossing were the glass bridges. In a moment of inspiration, I hid the final bridge. All the others were gaudy, beautiful constructions, but this one was a plain, thin walkway hidden amongst the flowers, barely wide enough for a human. Even if they had found it, it would be a nerve-wracking experience to cross. Better yet, I shaped the final island in the shape of a U, so that anyone trying to cross straight away would go tumbling into the ravine in the middle. The spikes lining the ground below would make that hard mistake to walk away from. All of which was a fine start. An eerie white forest and an ashen earth full of hidden pitfalls. I needed more. The night lantern I had bought contained a peculiar kind of crystal called a night vein, which drank in the light around it. I replaced that, pausing for hours at a time to let my mana recover from the draining task. And creek black fruits of night vein had hung from the branches, at which one of the darkness grew thicker, more solid. Soon the white trees were like ghosts in the abyssal gloom. Occupying myself in the long pauses between conjuring up night vein, I worked on the trees, carving them with wizened and ancient faces that seemed to suggest that this place had always existed, long before the current era. The first of the Arachne was in awe, as he watched the earth was remolded, the stone falling away like smoke dissolving in the wind. A faint swirl of grey dust, and then nothingness. And then a true artistry began. Trees rose, first red and then turning white as dull cloud of crystal crawled over their crusted iron limbs, encasing them in the colour of snow. The earth was consumed by the colours of ash as countless flowers sprouted, and endless field of grey. It was a desolate sight, as the trees twisted to take on human faces. The Arachne felt strangely sick. Was this just another creation, a spider shaped to have a human face? Were the memories he had strange and vivid fragments of a distant life, real at all? He hoped the Maker knew, because if the Maker didn't know, and he didn't know, then the inside of his own head would remain a mystery, and worse, an accident. He did not wish to be an accident. More than anything, the first of the Arachne wished to have a purpose and a place. A stone statue and a rat had joined them, standing silently. The rat on the statue's shoulder as they watched the new world take shape underground. It was a holy spectacle. I was in a state of artistic meditation, absolute calm, absolute stillness, the kind of peace only a dungeon could know, the peace of being that never needed to eat, breathe, or interrupt the thoughts of organic nonsense. As I painstakingly carved each tree's face with a look of intense, resigned sorrow, I pondered my schemes in the world above. Right now the unicorn was a being stored in Emma's care, and it would need to be transported once it was sold. Considering that they'd just announced the priceless beast's presence to the assortment of Colton's most ruthless thieves, it was safe to say that they were anticipating at least one attempt to steal it away, and security would be stringent. Waiting for it to be bought and turned over to less prepared hands was the safest chance. The hardest time to steal the unicorn would be a brief moment of its stage, but that would also be the perfect chance to humiliate Emma. Making the prize of his auction disappear would be such a sweet revenge for trying to kill my rat. And speaking of, through Argent I now had the greatest scouting force in the city. I had a lead in a very important way, and I was an unknown to them, and I could very easily know everything about them. The worst thing I could do then was to be predictable. Making my move when we were on guard expecting a thief would be surrounded that one key advantage. Instead, I should act to induce chaos and force them into a mistake. My first move, then, should be to make the poke a hornet's nest. I mentally sighed, finally satisfied with my creation. The supernatural gloom that laid over the forest made the reveal of the pale trees, the mournful faces, all the more shocking. I began to wind vines and bright blood red around the trees. First a few, and then on the first island you might see one or two splashes of color, but growing more and more common as you passed through the plateaus, over the bridges, until the final island almost everything was stained with red. Vines sprawled across the ground like veins, disturbing the peaceful grey flowers. They crushed and overwhelmed the stone trees, leaving knots of organic wriggling red in their place. Now, the finale. I carved an 8th island, connected to the 7th by a bridge made only of flowers. Their thin roots knotted together into a hanging bridge, just strong enough to take on a human's weight. On the island I hollowed out a shallow lake and filled its bed with overlapping stones of red iron ore, layered like the scales of an immense coiled snake. The water itself took on a tint and a hue of fresh blood. At the center of the lake would be an island. I seeded tall, proud flowers with long stalks that erupted into the trumpeted-shaped blossoms of the purest white. Their tall stems were lined with tiny needle-sharp hairs, poisonous in the extreme. An island of deadly beauty to fen of blood. I would reside there, in the middle of the poison garden that I'd raised up on a dais, as though a tablet of stone carved the two snakes entwined into a double helix. Where the jaws met, a small alcove would hold me. Bring me there, I told my newest creation. But fate had other plans. Fate was a cruel whore. Fate had heard my planning and couldn't resist throwing a wrench into the works. As he stepped forward, the walls began to writhe. Cracks split the foundations of the earth, sending rushes of dirt and stone tumbling free. I called it an earthquake, but it was localized entirely around my newest floor, tearing apart my finely crafted work, the bloodlust raging in my soul as the first intruder pushed through. It was a 6-legged hound made of swirling teeth and stone, spiked of obsidian rising from its spine, an earth elemental. End of chapter. Chapter 1.31 Men Plan, Gods Laugh. When the wheel had ceased to spin, the statue stepped forward, a woman of black obsidian in a diamond-studded dress, carrying an ivory chest. As the lid snapped open, the crowd breathed in with a massive anticipation. And crack split the air, and the stage was torn into splinters. The wheel and the statue vanished like soap bubbles, and only the jester remained, taking a low bow, and the earth behind him lifted up in a sloughed way from the debris, sundered by the rising peak of a tower made all from white stone. A square walled tower lifted up from the sky where the stage had been. It was split into 7 layers, divided by bands of dark red, where the walls were engraved with statues of men and women struggling to lift the next portion of the tower onto their shoulders, their faces permanently scowling in strain. Some stood tall, while others lay defeated on the ground. At the very top, 2 statues remained, carved in full, each bent with the weight of the pyramid or the cap of pure gold. "The Sevenfold Tower," the jester announced, striking his gloved hands together. "What a beautiful prize, O glorious day, beautiful! For as long as the tower stands, those with the strength to climb will receive the glory and generosity of the sun. Let champions from the 1,000 lands journey to the city to test their mettle. Whether it is strength or riches you desire, rise. If you wish to live 100 years, rise. If you would live a life that shines amongst the stars, rise." With each exclamation to climb, the jester grew fainter and more translucent, until by the 3rd cry he was gone entirely, with only an echo remaining a while longer. Sufi's mouth was slack with shock. Her thoughts were like water overflowing a cup. One thing pushed after the other in her head. She fought to keep the important things in view. Below, people were rushing to the tower for 4 entrances, fighting to be the first inside. First were the breaking out of the human tide, struggling to force its way through the doors. There would be a real flood of challengers once the news spread, both for their tower and the dungeon. They would be like locusts descending, and Sufi would need to entrench herself deeper to hold on to power. Her workshops, her forges, would be the ones to provide the adventurers with weaponry. Dwarf scouts and her guides would lead challengers in the dark. She would triumph. Her 2-fingered hand clenched into the malformed fist. She had been born with it, with 2 almost flippant protrusions of pink, wrinkled flesh where most were given slender fingers by the gods. Her mother had been accused of consorting with devils and cast out. Newborn Sufi in her hands. Nobody had thought that she would ever be worth anything. Nobody could have imagined that she would be the greatest artisan of her generation. It proved Sufi's basic theory. People were stupid. The world couldn't be predicted through the sheer weight of stupid decisions being made every day. Couldn't be reasoned with because it didn't run on reason. Usually what mattered was the ability to hold course when things went mad, to keep the goals in mind, steady as she goes, trust the right people. Most of all, you had to know what people wanted. Knowing why people acted was the closest you could come to guiding light. Sufi didn't trust Avery, and never would. They shared a small camaraderie, and a large host of reasons to kill each other. She didn't trust the gods, and they could change that any day they wished. They just needed to make gold rain from the heavens, and the sick rise from their beds, and Sufi would be the first to bow. But until then, they would be a lot of useless sods. So, of course, she didn't believe the promise, or rather, didn't believe that it was Colton's benefit. No, this had to be about the dungeon. Her mother had laid a hand on her shoulder, always near, always watching over her. Sufi closed her eyes and pondered. The question was, were the gods helping the dungeon or trying to harm it? In the end, the flood of adventurers coming to challenge the tower would attack the dungeon as well, making things much harder on the core. On the other hand, if the dungeon was particularly weak right now, it was a loose hypothesis born of speculation, but it made sense. This tower was an excellent delay. While the gods only wanted to harm the core, all they would have needed was to promise a reward to the first adventurer to conquer the dungeon. Sufi had always trusted her intuitions. To her right, Governor Kedlin was trying to muster his soldiers to intervene in the brawl below. Avery raised a hand to stop them. We'll let them fight. You can't stop a riot, Kedlin. Only let it exhaust itself. Once they've worn themselves out, we take control of the tower and begin limiting attempts. Beside them, Sufi slid off her throne. Cathara moved with her, the two of them hurrying down the steps. The mother catching on to the daughter's agitation. Their personal guard shoved them through the milling outskirts of the crowd. The hangers-on waiting to see the violence, and the adventurers clashed with the tower doors. As soon as they were safely down and beneath the roar of the crowd, Sufi turned to Cathara. This is a distraction. The dungeon is weak, and the gods are buying time. And what do? We make our move today. Disaster. Calamity, chaos! The earthhounds were pouring into my dungeon, ripping their way free from the walls and tearing up my beautiful work as they came rampaging through the fields of grey lilies. I had no creations down here who could guard me, save Adamant and Arachne. I had no defenses, no foundation on which to rely on. And they were coming fast. As I watched, the foremost hound vaulted between the islands, not even needing to look down to sense the chasms hidden amongst the flowers. It was only Adamant's quick thinking that stopped them from coming further. Leaning down, the silent golem planted his hands on the earth and caused the far edge of the cliff to crumble away just as the beast landed, sending it plummeting down a sliding wave of rubble. One down. Before I could taste even a small victory, another arrived with a breach in the walls. I was calling the lion and the fawn down as fast as I could, calling everything in my dungeon that would answer, but it was a grim situation. I could not return upstairs. Everything in my instincts as a dungeon prevented me from doing so, strongly enough that I felt pain, actual pain, just contemplating the idea. Delving had thinned my mana somehow, allowing me to move freely within, but now it was congealing again, coagulating around me like setting blood. The longer I waited, the more damage would be done when I moved again. The first clash was short and brutal. Adamant turned his fists to metal, meeting two hounds with blunt force. A punch tore a hound's skull to spray and shattered stone. Another smashed in a ribcage. Neither killed. Instead, the hounds reformed, slamming into Adamant from both sides. It was just like watching avalanches fight. Shapeless waves of earth crashed against each other as Adamant was torn to pieces and reformed. His fists were swinging like clubs. breaking the hounds only for their stone bodies to lift from the floor once more and be remade. The third hound joined the fray, leaping high as it seized Adamant by the skull and crushed down. He seized it by the throat and responded in kind, but another grabbed him by the leg, putting him down. I could feel his mana running out, exhausted by the constant reshaping of his own body. I fed him what I could, but it was an uphill struggle. The hounds must have had their own limits to how often they can be reborn, their own limited mana, but I couldn't sense it. A fourth hound was already leapt up the gap, barreling towards Adamant. "Give me to Argent," I commanded the newest creation, "and go and fight." I could sense his fear and unwillingness as he handed me down, Argent gripping me in her paws as we watched her brother struggle to rise against a sea of stony flesh and snapping jaws. Arachne waded in, seizing a hound in both hands and hoisting it overhead. One throw and the elemental shattered to pieces. Pieces that shivered and reformed, yes, but both me and Arachne were thrilled by the show's strength. I felt the brutal satisfaction in his mind, the joy at the simplicity of violence. No doubts, no worries, just movement and impact. He reached out to seize another, but this time the hounds were on guard, circling away, making him lunge after them with his clumsy lower body. He let his attention slip for a second, let one of the hounds slide towards his flank. Before I could warn him, it had already happened. The hound lunged forward and turned its head down. Out, its back out, it hit with the full of its weight and the long deadly spines of obsidian jutting out the back of spears. They pushed through the nacre armor and made the Arachne cry out. The sound neither human nor spider, but undeniably pained. With a sweeping backhand he shattered the hound in retribution, but half of his legs were left limping, a yellowish blood weeping from his side. In the background, Adamant managed to reform enough of himself to seize an element and rip him in two. The one that remained slowly backed away as his brothers began to reshape themselves. A fifth, and even a sixth hound vaulted over the gap. End of chapter. 1.32 Into the Fire. The glass fawn and the fungal lion arrived just as the last of the 8 hounds joined the melee, Adamant struggling to hold them at bay and the shield off the wounded Arachne. Again and again their stony jaws ripped pieces of him away, but he waded through them, striking left and right with a metal-clad arm and doing terrible damage. Leaping to his aid, the other 2 golems swept the stone hounds back. The elementals retreated as a group, spreading out, encircling the 4. In moments they had picked up their opponents, and they would be going 2 against 1. It was the Arachne that was in the worst position. His 2 opponents wove and circled, forcing him to constantly turn on his crippled legs. Blood oozed from the damage already done. Newborn and the spider had no fighting instincts, and could only clumsily apply his strength and great sweeping blows. For every strike that landed, scattering one of the hounds to rubble, the remaining beast was able to rip his injured legs, until one of them was torn away entirely, and another hung as limp as a broken puppet. Maybe there was something I could do. As the stone hounds reformed, they swept the roots and stems away from the grey flowers, trampling under their clumsy bodies. I took that and made it my weapon, boring my mana into the odds and ends, and I made them live again. No sooner had the hound created its new body than its stony flesh began to crack and come apart, wriggling with tendrils of green forcing their way through its skin. In moments it had dissolved back into a pile of loose stone, and I had woven the mass of greenery over it like a net, keeping the component parts from gathering again, which left the remaining one suddenly alone against a bigger, stronger opponent. Catching the hound on one hand, the Arachne plunged the bladed fingertips into its side, again and again, ripping out chunks of earth and stone in a bloodless disembowelment. Finally, the beast sagged and collapsed, not coming back this time. Its store of mana had finally been exhausted. With no opponents left standing, the Arachne was free to aid the fawn. The delicate glass fighter moved beautifully, weaving between the 2 opponents and jabbing out countless times with its spear. Only none of its elegant strikes did much of real harm. It lacked the brute strength to actually wound its opponents. For once, the agile and lethal fawn wasn't the deadliest thing on the battlefield. The hound lunged at him, and the fawn slammed his spear through the top of its head and pinned it to the earth. Using the anchored shaft to perform a vaulting kick, it slammed both hooves into the second assailant. The hound was sent flying, bouncing and rolling across the ground. The show-off. It was a flashy move, but it didn't have the raw power to kill. Behind him, the pinned elemental simply reshaped its body to free itself, and now he was in the middle of two opponents with no weapon. Luckily, the Arachne was there, sweeping one of them aside with a charging swing of his arms. The fawn seized its spear again, and now they were back to back, the glass column guarding the Arachne's wounded flank. They fought their way towards the remaining two, each locked in their own battles. The line was fierce, but the hounds were experienced in fighting together. It had one of them pinned on the floor, mauling the elements with its claws, but the other clung to its hindquarters and took a pound of mushroom flesh for each pound of stone. It was a bloodless and yet brutal fight, taking blow for blow. Adamant turned his entire body to steel, repelling both the hounds and him with a sudden surge of strength. He caught one of them with his extended arm across the throat in a brutal clothesline as he rushed forward, running full tilt at the elemental ripping at the lion's heels. He didn't stop. He simply crashed through the hound, scattering it in a burst of dust and rubble. This time it didn't get back up. Unhindered now, the lion forced its prey down and tore the hound to shreds. It reformed, of course, and then the two Adamant had left behind caught up. But the 2-3 was better than Oddston a moment ago. Slowly, Adamant turned back to a man of earth, the trick too exhausting to keep up for more than a split second. The 3 hounds on one side and 2 on the other, the 2 groups met in a circle, 4 against 5. Reaching out, I even out the odds, making roots and vines tear open one another of one of the hounds. It was looking up when the earth began to shake again. This time the rupture split one of the islands in 2. The flowers and clods of earth raining down as the twin halves drifted apart in a vast sound of grinding stone. My art! My beautiful creations, all my work! Why, once in a lifetime inspiration, gone in seconds. I watched a tree come unearthed and unground and tumble down to the crevice. I wish I had hands so that I could personally strangle the life out of whoever was responsible. Barring that, whoever was nearest. I may have been second thoughts when the invader came through the new-formed rift. It was a huge, roughly a lizard in form. It was a small hill's worth of stone, hauling itself up from the crevice with limbs as thick as tree trunks, bladed talons, and scraped the ground. Huge chunks of flint emerged from the edges of its mouth, drawing the lips apart to show multiple rows of teeth in concentric rings. The hounds were retreating, scampering back, and it let out one huge huffing cloud of yellowish vapor, covering the island that it stood on. I froze as I watched, silent, without a plan. It leaned down and scraped a tusk against the earth, over and over again, flicking motions. I was wondering what I was seeing when a spark leapt up, and a cloud of yellow vapor exploded into a sea of flames. I really had no response to that, but to silently, continuously scream. The guard watching Trevelyan had left to go see what the fuss was about, drawn irresistibly away from the post by the smell of beer and the roar of a good riled-up crowd. Trevelyan beamed as he stepped off his clothes and hid them under the bed. Oh, he was proud of the scheme, proud as a peach. And when the next shift came in, chewing on a wad of tobacco as the sun gleamed in the brim of the shiny helmet, what did he see? Why, he saw the guard that he was supposed to be replaced, not at the post, but in a cell, clutching the bars, naked as the day was bright. He turned away, groaning, "What in the God's sight is going on, Casper? He got me! Oh, he got me! That clever fricking bastard!" Trevelyan wailed, fighting on to hold back the stupid, audacious smirk that he oh so wanted to plaster itself across his face. Or rather, across Casper's face. He tricked me into the cage, and then he got me right in the head with a club, and took my clothes. My damn clothes! He went right out the door. Casper, Casper, you fricking idiot! Covering his eyes with his hands to spare himself the sight of Casper's danglies, the guard slid the key into the lock of the door. The door had foiled Trevelyan's best attempts at lockpicking for days. Popped open. As easy as that. All right, let's get you dressed and then we'll go right to the madam to report this. I'm sorry, but you're out of luck on this one. I can't cover for you now. About that, and then Trevelyan gave the unlucky fool a quick tap on the head. He'd taken a hard, tough bread that they'd given him, melted it into a paste in water, and formed it into a dense little bread club. It made a pretty little conch against the shiny helmet. Man grunted and crumpled to his knees. Trevelyan hit him again, and then it all went away to the floor. Trevelyan, that grin finally surfacing, helped himself to the guard's clothes and face. Dwarves were a little trickier than humans, made him feel as if he was sucking in his gut the whole time. But dwarf he could do. Horrible beasties who could rip prison bars in two, or tiny white rats who could slip right through them, not so much. It seemed humanish was his limit. Your turn, matey. He swung the door closed and locked it. Good luck explaining this to the next fellow to come along. With a whistle on his lips, Trevelyan sauntered right out to the steps of the prison and into daylight. He walked right into the oncoming platoon of guards, led by the pompous-looking young dwarf with jewels on his hilt of his sword and a shine on his armor, like he had never been used. You! He jabbed a finger at Trevelyan. Join up, we're going to the tower. The whole battalion lifted their swords to the sky and shouted, Hurrah! And a burst of noisy bravado. Trevelyan, mentally frozen, silently stepped into the back of the formation. Tower? He asked the nearest dwarf. Fricking thing just popped up. Don't ask me. Now we're going to go climb it. All these nobles, they're bonkers, I'm telling you. The man whispered back, shaking his head so that the wooden tokens woven into his beard clacked together. Bonkers! Oh, yes. Out of the frying pan and into the fire. Trevelyan had no choice but to join the steady march towards the distant tower, cursing himself silently all the way. End of chapter. And that concludes this batch video. I hope that you enjoyed. If you wish to support the channel, there are numerous ways to do so down below. Until next time, I hope that you all have a good one. And I'll see you all in the next video. Cheers.